ho attaccato questa live perché ho detto vabbè, mi faccio la maratona per giocare a Puoi Playtime 5, è bello tutto, siamo tutti felici, ok. Però ragazzi, la problematica qual è? La problematica è che non è uscito, non è ancora fuori. E da quello che ho visto, io credo che esca tra un qualcosa tipo un'oretta, e questa è una problematica. Perché? Perché capite bene che è un po' complicato attaccare maratona su un gioco quando quel gioco non esiste. E molti si chiederanno: Riccardo, ma come vogliamo occupare questo tempo? Questo tempo lo occupiamo facendo qualcosa di pazzesco, un bel recappino su dove abbiamo lasciato il punto, così che le persone che stanno qui perché amano la mia persona ma non hanno idea di cosa andiamo a fare possono comunque andare a mettersi in carreggiata. Per tale ragione io volevo fare tipo una reactionina. Yori, buona visione!
Poppy Playtime has one of the most complex stories out there, with hours of lore spanning across games, spin-offs, books, ARGs, and more. But today, I've put every single piece of the story we have gotten so far all together to create my complete Poppy Playtime timeline. Disclaimer, this timeline is my opinion of the Poppy Playtime story based on all the lore we've gotten so far, but I hope you guys enjoy this movie-length video. Our tale starts in the year 1930 with a man named
Bei tempi, il 1930, ragazzi, come slidavo. Ma voi, quando vi metto i sottotitoli, mi ringraziate perché non sapete oppure in realtà potreste benissimo capirlo in inglese?
Elliot Ludwig.
Perché io i sottotitoli li metto per voi, cioè, capirei.
Elliot was your average everyday family man with a wife and a daughter living a
No, dobbiamo riniziare perché non mi sono guardato nulla, stavo pensando ai tuberi.
Our tale starts in the year 1930 with a man named Elliot Ludwig.
Che stavate facendo nel 1930, ragazzi?
Elliot was your average everyday family man with a wife and a daughter living a happy life. But Elliot, an inventor at heart obsessed with creating things, had an idea. He wanted to create his very own toy factory that would produce and provide toys for millions of children around the world, leading to him founding Playtime Co. Where
Non era ancora nata, sguaigavo nell'industria, il mio cervello ogni tanto dice di non capire nell'inglese, quindi i sottotitoli sono ottimi. Seguivo l'ascesa di un pittore tedesco, ma spero di no.
From here, Elliot went to work, spending hours upon hours working at the factory trying to start up the brand and get it on its feet. But while trying to serve families around the world, he started to forget his own, not being able to be at home as much with his wife and daughter due to the long grueling hours the factory demanded, often leaving his house during early hours of the morning and returning at late hours in the night, being
Ma lui ha un cubo nero in faccia perché è tipo Cristo prima del face reveal che non si mostra, dopo lo fanno vedere. Io ragazzi non mi ricordo niente della lore.
seen as creepy by his neighbors even. And soon enough, his wife could no longer take it, packing up and leaving him and his daughter during his most trying times.
Mr. Slane.
Elliot Ludwig had spent the last 2 decades trying to create products to no real avail. Nothing really seemed to stick with the public. That is until the year 1950, when Elliot would create the product that would change his entire life. Poppy Playtime. Poppy Playtime was a baby doll toy, which was a super common thing in the 1950s, but Elliot's was extra special, because she, unlike the rest, could seemingly talk back and forth with children, making her feel almost lifelike.
I'm a real girl. Just like
Allora, da un
you.
lato,
Along with her
è disumanamente creepy, però dall'altro sì che figo. Cioè, ti rompi i coglioni, grande conversazione con bambola, ma che contenuto è?
hair being scented like poppy flowers, a soothing scent that would calm down the children that played with it. This release would explode the company and was
Ti ho mandato un sondaggio importante su WhatsApp, poi quando hai tempo puoi rispondermi? Certo, Leo. Leo è un vocale di 12 secondi. Io lo riproduco, non dici nulla di grave, vero? Tanto mi è scritto, cioè, penso che sia riproducibile. Io lo riproduco.
Riccardo, domanda importante, tu sei più da... Oppure da...
Ciao Leo, mi ritengo più da...
extremely successful, finally giving Elliot everything he ever wanted. His toys were now quickly in the hands of millions of children, and now that his company was growing, he was able to hire new employees, with the first notable one being Thomas Clark, hired in 1955, while
Potete salutare per favore Thomas Clark, ragazzi? Ciao Thomas Clark, grazie ragazzi. E soprattutto, lavorereste nella fabbrica?
also creating the Gram Pack at some point, a backpack with retractable hands at the sides that employees could use to reach faraway items at ease to help with efficiency. And
Pensa che fico lavorare, ti danno il braccino, quello per tirare le robe. Ma io ci andrei subito a lavorare, raga. Ma sai che content? Belli, ma solo per il coso con le braccia.
furthermore, Elliot used his success to start doing factory tours, allowing families to visit the factory and see how everything was being created, expanding the company's growth and brand more, along with working on new products like the Doughy Dough, a Play-Doh type toy led by the mascot Doughy the Dough Man, that was another massive success, propelling the company more.
Lo amo, uno dei miei preferiti, ragazzi, il Goat.
Although, despite all of this success, at some point during this period, Elliot Ludwig's daughter would tragically pass away.
No! O Seven per la figlia.
And just like that, Elliot's family that inspired him to provide toys for millions of others was now gone, putting him into a deep, deep depression. However, Elliot wasn't just going to stop there. If the factory is what dragged his family away, then maybe it's what could bring it back together. He had thousands of these lifelike Poppy dolls laying around, so being an inventor, he wondered if he could use one of them as a new shell for his daughter and attempt to revive her himself.
Ma chi pensa ciò? Cioè, io ti voglio bene, no? Ma ti stira la bambina. Qual è il momento dove tu in casa tua fai... Ma mi sa che era ficco in una bambola. Cioè, come ti viene? Ma come ti viene? Io non capisco questi come arrivano a determinati pensieri.
Was a Hail Mary to say the least, but it was worth a try. And after experimenting on her with the slim but non-zero chance to save her life, magically it worked. Perfectly, as a matter of fact. His daughter was back as a living and breathing Poppy doll. She could
Follia.
move, think, talk, and feel. Elliot's daughter was revived, but this situation scarred him deeply as he realized he hadn't been spending any time with his daughter he almost just lost while working 24/7. So instead, he would develop himself a new home inside of the factory where they both lived, right across from his office, allowing him to spend more time with her during the busy hours and still have that semblance of the family life.
William Afton ha plan, eh? Sì, cioè questi perdono i cari e pensano in quale luogo possono finire. Raga, allora io non voglio fare le corna eccetera, ma io un giorno dovessi malauguratamente, facendo le corna eccetera, perdere mia madre, ragazzi, io la butto nella friggitrice ad aria. Cioè, mamma! Vieni un secondo! Una domanda. Bella importante, eh? Bella importante questa. Poniamo il caso che tu, malauguratamente, facendo le corna, stiamo facendo una gag, purtroppo passi a miglior vita. Ok? In quale oggetto vorresti che io ti faccio rinascere? Cioè, tipo che metto la tua coscienza in un oggetto e tu diventi quell'oggetto. No, oggetto. No, un oggetto inanimato. Io ho pensato alla friggitrice d'aria. No, per te. Cioè, ti metterei nella friggitrice d'aria. No, non è perché mi serve a te. Tu diventi una teiera? Tipo la Bella e la Bestia. E poi parli soltanto facendo i fischi fortissimi. Una candela? Una candela perpetua divieni. Ok.
Però di quelle particolari, artistiche, tutte lavorate.
Quelle belle, certo.
Oli essenziali.
Certo.
Per esempio, tu sei... Io capisco
Sì?
che tu parli, se sei agitato, allora profumo di lavanda. Se hai bisogno di concentrazione, aranciamare e
Cioè tu in base ai mood cambi l'odore della tua candela.
Esatto.
Ma te la sei studiata sta cosa già?
No.
Sei un genio. Brava, va bene. Senti, io ti devo fare una richiesta che mi è venuta in mente mentre parlavamo, però te lo voglio specificare questa cosa, perché sennò sembra che io ti ho chiamato apposta per, e non è così, ci tengo a specificarlo. Me lo fai un caffè? No, però non è che ti ho chiamato per questo! Giuro! Non ti ho chiamata per questo!
Ma hai chiamato per me?
No, mi è venuto in mente mentre parlavamo!
Sì, ciao, ciao. Il caffè come lo vuoi? Con macchiato o con latte o puro?
Caffè e latte.
Sei uno schifoso perché non è vero. La candela. Non te ne frega niente.
Non è vero, me ne frega!
Life he lost when originally starting the company. Playtime Co. was doing better than ever, riding off of Poppy Playtime's success, and naturally, Elliot Ludwig expanded the company further by creating the Make a Friend machine in 1960, which was an interactive machine used for tours where children could create another new toy, Catnap, along with more new products
Darei tutto per creare un piccolo Victor Blade parlante.
like Braun the Dinosaur in 1961 and Boxy Boo in 1966, presumably
Gli tiri la cordicella e dice le sue frasi più gettonate. Sta lì e fa: "Oh, sono lacustre!" Così e fa le mosse. Ma ragazzi, oh, mani mandarini! Bellissimo, quanto vorrei un piccolo Victor Blade con me.
along with many other undated toys to keep expanding the company's growth. But Elliot, again, was still a family man and wanted to help even more children around the world outside of just giving them toys. And at an unknown point during this success, he would create the Young Geniuses Program, a program where many gifted children around the world would be hand-selected by Elliot Ludwig after applying to come to the Playtime Co factory and actually learn how the
Io non sarei mai entrato in questa scuola per bambini dotati. Cioè, sono dotato, ma non in quel modo. E non è un riferimento sessuale, è tipo un riferimento a qualche, disabilità.
toys are produced through their factories and innovation labs,
Mi dai la roba con i cubi, prendo il cerchio, sul triangolo.
with the hope that eventually when they grow up, they would take over the company as Elliot and his many colleagues aged away. Many children would be selected for this program, like Bruno White, who will be important later, but the most special one of them all was a boy named Harley Sawyer, an intentionally isolated child with no interest for friendships or cares for others, with a rough life back at home, but despite this was an
Questo era uno di quelli, raga, che suona il pianoforte, però tipo solo la musica classica, quelli che fanno un po' paura, che hanno quel QI che è più alto ma che ti terrorizza allo stesso tempo, capito?
extremely
SALV
Ciao
e
Matreius!
Come stai? Indovina chi compie gli anni proprio oggi?
Auguri Goat, mi raccomando, e taglia la torta!
focused mind, obsessed with the scientific process. When selected for the Young Geniuses program, he saw how dedicated Elliot Ludwig and Playtime Co. was for innovation, which enlightened him further, giving him purpose and determination he never had before. Joining the program and getting to work on these creations with Elliot finally made the troubled young boy happy. However,
Scusate ragazzi, cioè quindi questo ha trovato il ragazzino super dotato e si è messo a fare la collaborazione col ragazzino per la fabbrica. Cioè questo lavorava, è tipo là il fuffaguru di ieri che sta milionario a 14 anni.
there was a big looming issue. While Harley cared a ton about progress and innovation, his isolation and lack of friendships had turned him into a cynic. He didn't care about trying to make the children happy or benefiting humanity. He just wanted to see how far he could go with his creations, which went completely against Elliot Ludwig's ethics, causing them to argue against each other, where after a little while, despite him being one of the smartest children in
Fuffa bambola.
Sì.
the entire program, he unfortunately was removed by Elliot. Harley, following this, was enraged, believing Elliot was a backstabber after inviting him in the first place just to get rid of him, but for now, he was gone. In 1972, Elliot would sign with the company Warnbach Construction to build new areas of the factory.
Allora ragazzi, posso dire tutto? Allora, questo mi pare che fosse il capitolo 3. Possibile? Raga, il capitolo 3 era wild. Il capitolo 3 era insane. A parer mio, il migliore. Cioè, il 3 era follia, ragazzi. Tutta la mappa sotterranea con l'area. Cioè, questa roba era assurda da giocare.
For instance, a theater where tour visitors could watch shows acted and based on the Playtime Co characters, with one of the main mascots of the area being Boxy Boo, among many other sectors of Playtime Co. However, a few years later in 1976, after decades of company growth, Elliot wanted to do something even bigger to further his vision of helping and providing enjoyment to children around the world. He had brought toys and opportunities to millions of families.
Ciao, gay! Jay. Ciao, Jay. Ciao, Jay.
But he also wanted to help the many others without families.
Come si chiama il ragazzino, ragazzi? Nome al ragazzino? Dai, sparate in chat. Nome ragazzino, come lo chiamiamo? Secondo me è tipo un Ben. Un Michael, bello Michael. Giovanni Ernesto. Ok. Enea Paolino. Ah, Paolino perché è piccino. Bello Paolino, per ora il migliore. Billy, pigiama, va bene.
Leading to him creating the Playtime Co. Orphanage Program, a program ran by Elliot that specialized in providing homes and love to millions of children who were orphaned with no parents. And in order to house all these children, he would have Warren Bach build Playcare, their in-house orphanage where after a tram ride into a dome, they were met with a city-like structure with homes, schools, counselors' offices, play areas, and a store full of toys. It was everything a child would ever want while waiting to be adopted. Around this time...
Ma onesto, ragazzi, poi è andato tutto di merda e quindi sappiamo che è finita molto male, però poniamo il caso che tu sei un ragazzino che è orfano e stai in un luogo del genere. Ragazzi, ma io ci darei la firma per essere orfano, cioè guarda che figo. Sinceramente mi prendo a male se mi adottano, guarda dove stai.
More toys were also created, like Yarnaby, who was a part of a wildlife conservation campaign to save animals, and Candy Cat, a gumball machine and dispenser. However, deep within the...
Come in realtà no, bro, stai sottoterra in un luogo dove tutto ciò è come vivere a Disneyland.
background of this success, while all of this was going on, Elliot Ludwig began to wonder about how he was able to create such a perfect doll in Poppy Playtime decades past, and if he could reproduce the results again. Since if he could figure out the secret to literal resurrection, he can not only entertain children, he could save their lives in the same way he did his daughter. The only thing he really knew about her was that she was a doll scented like poppies. So he began to experiment creating a poppy gel formula to attempt to resurrect other small animals like rats, things that were ultimately unsuccessful but gave him promise to keep working, while also hiring other new employees like Stella Graber to manage Playcare,
Un saluto a Stella.
Eddie Ritterman, the head of research.
Eddie è palesemente nero, eh. Cioè, nel senso, non c'è razzismo, non c'è nulla, mai di è nero. Eddie è Cobra Bubbles di Lilo e Stitch. Guardalo, è letteralmente Cobra Bubbles. Guarda Eddie. Eddie è Cobra.
Leith Pierre, the head of innovation, and Jimmy Roth, the head of marketing, to expand the toy side of the company further. In the early
Sì, Eddie ha cambiato skin, sì.
1980s, Playtime Co. was still large, but it needed another big product to keep their name in the spotlight. They had created a ton of new toys to fill up the company's successful lineup, but it wasn't until the year 1984 when they would come up with the company's biggest life-changing idea yet, Huggy Wuggy, a furry stuffed animal toy that was extremely cute, equipped with Velcro hands that stuck together, as their market research showed anxious children were calmed by a toy that could hug them back. They would release this toy to an absolute smashing success, becoming immediately the biggest toy Playtime Co. had ever produced.
Sì, però è carino, dai. Cioè, nel senso, poi diventa... Cioè, non è l'emblema della tranquillità e della calma, però, cioè, effettivamente è molto carino.
Taking the place as the unofficial mascot of the entire company. Then, in 1985, they would expand on this success even more by creating a female counterpart to Huggy, this time who was pink and had eyelashes, Kissy and Missy, along with even smaller, more affordable Huggy Wuggies, the Mini Huggies. These toys, 50 years after Playtime Co.'s opening, skyrocketed the company into the biggest it's ever been, and at this point, it seems like Playtime Co. would never fail. However, an issue that quickly arose was Elliot Ludwig's age. Elliot had been working on the factory for the entire 50-year history, and as time began to pass, he started to give give more and more power to one of the employees he hired during his time.
Ancora Bubbles?
Pierre, the
No,
head
questo
of
non è
innovation.
questo è Lit Pier. Ma tu immagina, passi anni sottoterra in un mondo colorato, circondato dai tuoi amici e con l'unica preoccupazione di trovare una famiglia, poi la trovi. Vieni strappato da tutto questo e gettato in un mondo dove nulla di ciò che conosci esiste. Non c'è colore, non ci sono edifici strambi, nessun momento di svago e tutti pretendono cosa sulle idee o rispettano che tu ragioni come loro. Sei un alieno nel tuo mondo. Se ti adottano, per questo ti dico non vorrei essere adottato. Cioè il problema è solo se tu te ne vai.
An arrogant and somewhat greedy businessman known to overwork his employees and threaten to fire them if they didn't do a good job, but was otherwise actually very well liked by Elliot, as he made it a key point to stay true to Elliot's vision as he took on more roles at Playtime Co, culminating in the late 1980s, where Elliot Ludwig would finally pass away, leaving Leaf Pierre to
Seven,
take
ragazzi, Elliot Ludwig, miglior vita, miglior vita, lo salutiamo.
control of the company.
Bella
Upon
Pierre.
exploring what Elliot had left behind, he was shocked to see that behind closed doors there was Poppy. The real living and breathing Poppy, something nobody had ever seen in the factory before. While over in his office, the documents of him trying to use Poppy gel to revive rats were found. These things Leith and his team began to study, but over on the toy side, he had also left one more thing. Plans for the Smiling Critters. A set
Un saluto agli Smiling Critters.
of 8 different Care Bear inspired plushes, all with their very own personalities, led by Dog Day, and included others like Bobby Bear Hug and Hoppy Hopscotch that
Ma lui s'addimenta, ragazzi! Ognuno ha un odore! Hoppy Hopscotch s'addimenta! Bellissimo Hoppy Hopscotch, il mio preferito.
that would be sold as plushes and would spit out their own unique scents based upon their personalities. Like Bobby, who is a character focused on love, emitting a rose scent, for instance. This was Playtime Co.'s most ambitious toy line yet off the back of the recent Huggy success. And Leith, being the businessman he was, loved this idea and sank absolutely all the money he could into the line, creating tons of the plushies to sell and even producing an entire cartoon to build the brand further. But he
Bravo.
also had one more trick under his sleeve, specifically with the last smiling critter, Catnap, who was the critter all about getting enough sleep, with his plush scent originally
Chi voleva dormire a sufficienza? Sa di lavanda, ragazzi. Bellino, ti stunna tutto, Catnap.
being lavender. However, after seeing what Elliot was doing with all the Poppy Playtime flower stuff and the success of her Poppy scent as a toy back in 1950, Leith and his team would instead create a new gas for Catnap, this time made from the
No, Jenny, grazie infinitamente. Grazie.
poppy flowers,
Candela.
being a dark, thick red that when administered and tested had extremely strong sleeping properties, knocking
Ma ragazzi, ma scusatemi tanto, ma cioè, io capisco tutto, che ci sono elementi molto fantastici in questa storia, ma questo Cristiano dove ha trovato i permessi per vendere un giocattolo che ti spara il fumo che ti manda a KO per dormire? Cioè, ma è un po' wild per tuo figlio, sta giocando una certa e sviene, cioè non è il massimo.
people out
Ad oggi io lo comprerei instant, però per i bambini un po' pazzo, no?
completely like how Catnap would in the show, while also having notable adverse effects like night terrors and nightmares. Regardless, during production, employees noticed the red smoke coming from the plushes, but chose to send them out anyway, leading up to 1989, where the plushes in the cartoon would finally release, where things went horribly. The show
Merda.
itself was very unpopular. Children were extremely scared of Catnap, who was completely silent and spewed the intimidating gas to the critters in a terrifyingly uncanny way, making
Ma brother, ma non mi stupisco. Cioè, andò male perché il gatto era terrificante. King, guardalo. Cioè, ma quale ragazzino prova della serenità a guardare lui? Ma guarda gli occhi!
completely silent and spewed
Ti
the
dico una cosa buffa, se sei la multinazionale più potente del mondo fai quello che ti pare. Frate, ma sputa il gas. Ma immagina tuo figlio.
intimidating gas to the critters in a terrifyingly uncanny way, making the show almost immediately a failure. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the plushes themselves, specifically Catnap's, as after the plushes went out to stores, Playtime Co. would instantly fall under extreme controversy. Children began to
Bella per il divano!
Sembra l'incubo di Satana. Come pensavano avrebbe funzionato.
Fate un investimento pazzo.
You have horrifying nightmares after getting the Catnap plush and inhaling said red gas, as news articles and television urge parents to not let their children near the Catnap plush or any of these smiling critters for that matter, destroying the company's entire reputation overnight. Playtime Co. eventually ended up recalling the Catnap plush completely while trying to save the rest of the line and creating new alternate lines like the Nightmare Critters, but it was no use. Nobody wanted to step anywhere near the critters.
Brother, ma perdonami, ma tu ti vedi la linea che ti fallisce e li fai ancora più cattivelli di prima? Perché è stato un po' baddy adesso, guarda. Questa è la linea teenagers, guardali.
Save the rest of the line and creating.
Però loro sono molto cool, eh. Loro sono veramente... Cioè, loro, se li fai adesso, uguali... Brother, tu hai fatto i nuovi Labubu. Cioè, tu sai questa roba quanto andrebbe sold out IRL ora? Guarda qua, ma guarda il coccodrillo che figo!
Lines like the Nightmare Critters, but it was no use. Nobody wanted to step anywhere near the critters anymore. And just like that, with the snap of a finger, the factory Elliot Ludwig had produced was now in a major depression. The millions of dollars invested were wasted, the smiling critters were a failure, and the company seemed like it was on a one-way spiral out of existence. With Playtime Co.'s
1990, ragazzi, nascevo io.
reputation being destroyed by the Catnap Disaster, Leith Pierre was
Non è vero.
getting desperate. He was running low on funds, and if nothing changed soon, Playtime Co. was going to go down in flames quickly. His only real hope left was Poppy and the red gel. If he could figure out how these things worked and could create real living toys just like Elliot, the company would have no competition. They'd have the best toys on the market by far. The only issue is he didn't know how they worked. And in an act of desperation, he needed some help and would turn over to Elliot's Young Geniuses program from a few decades back.
Ha chiamato il villain! Ha chiamato il ragazzino, quello genio che in realtà era un mago del male ed è stato assunto da lui che anche lui è un mago del male. Ma ragazzi, ma è un team up terrificante.
Hiring an investigator, Jared Lockhart, to
Ah no, ok, ha chiamato Sherlock Holmes.
track down all of the old applicants and list out what they've done as they aged, where one above them all seemed to stick out among the rest. Dr. Harley Sawyer.
È tornato! Sì, era come dicevo io, è tornato.
Who had, since his days at Playtime Co., became a neuroscientist with years of experience under his belt. And while he was originally kicked by Elliot Ludwig for his lack of morals, with no real other options, Leith brought him back, sending a letter bringing him onto the team on January 15th, 1990, where when doing so, Harley went to work, trying to figure out how the Poppy doll's life worked by taking the toy apart piece by piece to find that inside were real-life human remains.
Ma che schifo. Ma che schifo. Cioè, no?
Figure out how the Poppy doll's life worked by taking the toy apart piece by piece to find that inside were real-life human remains.
Che schifo.
Knowing it was then possible to create a living toy out of an organism, Sawyer then kept studying the Poppy doll while creating a few small experiments of his own to try and recreate the success. But it was when reading back on Elliot's rat experiment when Sawyer saw it notably cited that while rats were unsuccessful, larger test subjects might reveal better results. But then, where was he going to get a larger body to experiment on? Well, conveniently, Elliot had recently perished and had an available and capable body open for testing. After all,
cioè, scusate, hanno usato il cadavere di coso per fare i test?
perished and had an available and capable body open for testing.
Ma ragazzi, ma è wild.
After all, it's not like he had a family that would notice where his body went. So Harley took out some of his bones and other parts and mixed it with various different metals found throughout the factory to again try and recreate life. And behold, upon doing this, it was...
No! Regà! Ma quindi il villain del 5 è lui! No! Ho capito ora! Raga, non avevo collegato. Ok.
Seemingly a success. He had created a quad robotic
Che schifo.
creature that
Ah, no, non lo è. Ah, ok, niente.
was living, breathing, and moving, named Experiment 1006 to continue off the numbers of Elliot Ludwig, also known as the prototype, Harley's first test at creating life. The prototype was very interesting, because while at his core he was just a bunch of random parts strapped together, he was extremely intelligent just like Elliot, almost too intelligent, seemingly retaining the smart and inventor-like qualities of his original body, but morally was completely different, being extremely violent towards the employees that tried to contain him, even using his inventor skills to craft a laser pointer from an alarm clock in his cell, and destroy the camera watching it on his chamber, where when an employee would enter to check up on him, he would kill them.
Guarda che io non me le ricordavo ste cose, cioè, follia.
The prototype seemingly disassembled the digital alarm clock within his room and utilized the battery, along with several other components, to create a laser pointer, which he then fired into the security camera, disabling it. Once function returned to the camera, the room appeared to be empty. One surveillance specialist went in to confirm his absence. However, the prototype had hidden in one of the camera's blind spots. One casualty occurred.
Otherwise, the
Follia. No, Marco, ma io non credo che sia solo un braccio. Cioè, secondo me fanno vedere solo un braccio perché non hanno ancora fatto il reveal. Però sicuramente è perché devono mostrarlo.
creation, despite being living and breathing,
Nel canale YouTube ufficiale di Poppy hanno confermato che non sono la stessa persona con l'ultimo video. Cioè, quindi il prototipo non è Elliot. Cioè, il boss della società, eccetera.
didn't need to eat or anything to survive, which was a plus. And he also couldn't speak, but
Vabbè, ma lui, raga, lui... Cioè, il vero villain è lui, eh. Guarda com'è vestito, guarda il capello. Lui segue i bambini.
had the ability to mimic other people's voices, listening in on the many conversations around the factory collecting data. So overall, the prototype was a success, but he was extremely dangerous. Employees advised Harley Sawyer to destroy the creation, however he refused as he found his intelligence to be extraordinary and worth studying, so he would keep him around for now. But another problem still faced. Harley had no more capable bodies to experiment on and needed to find a use for these experiments fast for Leith Pierre or face the company shutting down and losing the job he had been wanting since a young boy. Conveniently for Harley though, Elliot had spent his time building up an entire orphanage below the factory, filled with children that had no families to account for them and check up on them if something were to happen.
Po' wild, eh. Po' wild.
Plus, he also had this red smoke technology created by Leith that could be used to control when they were awake and when they were asleep, like their very own personal anesthesia. This led to Harley experimenting on some of the children and tried shoving them into the shelves of the brand's iconic toys to try and make something valuable for Leith and the business to sell, but was met with failure after failure after failure. Some instances including Experiment 1015, who showed minor brain activity but otherwise didn't work in the slightest, or a little while later, Experiment 1026, who survived for 45 minutes and held promise, being able to look at whoever was talking to them, and even track down an employee's index finger when prompted, but otherwise was also unsuccessful. He couldn't reproduce what he did with the prototype into the shell of an actual toy like Elliot did, only being able to create experiments that would live for a few seconds and die off in their small toy bodies.
Sarei incredibile in un corpo di un giocattolo, ragazzi. Immaginate un mio Funko Pop parlante. Dai, non mi comprereste? Ogni tanto dico qualche frase, racconto i proverbi romaneschi. Mo' me lo riscattate uno, quindi devo prendere il libro perché tanto adesso... li ho nominati, adesso lo riscatto uno. Guarda, aspetta. Dove sta? Esci. Già il libro pronto. E secondo me sarebbe veramente wild, eh. Sarebbe veramente divertente. Quel gatto è un'ape perché è un gatto o un gatto perché è un'ape? Dimmelo tu. Eccolo Pablet. Bella Pablet. E che abbiamo riscattato qua? Il proverbio romanesco? A Roma si dice, dove non c'è guadambio, la remissione è certa. Mai detto a Roma, però ormai lo sappiamo.
Was not working. But then he chose to try something life-changing. What if instead of trying to cram a
Ricky,
human
scusa se
body
interrompo,
into
puoi
a...
guardare 5 secondi su Insta, ti ho mandato una cosa fatta col cuore.
Non è una mia foto stampata sborrata, vero? Oddio, un disegnino. Oddio, un disegnino. Ragazzi, un disegnino. Ragazzi, mi ha fatto un disegnino, ragazzi. Un bel disegnino e c'è anche Bet 10. Guarda che bellino. Guarda Bet 10. Bellissimo, Luca, grazie mille. Qua ci sono io. Ci sono anche io a figura intera. Ragazzi, sono il fan più grande delle vostre fan art. Chiunque voglia disegnare e fare le robe, fatele, perché io me le guardo estremamente volentieri, le adoro.
a small
Siete stupendi. L'altro giorno una ragazza mi ha fatto un disegno con tavoletta grafica bellissimo.
toy-sized creature, he chose to make the toys themselves larger. Human.
No, aspetta, non ho seguito, no, audio!
Few seconds, he chose to try something life-changing. What if instead of trying to cram a human body into a small toy-sized creature, he chose to make the toys themselves larger? Human-sized toys. This would solve everything, as Harley would no longer need to fit all of the parts into a tiny toy-sized body, and it could still provide value to the company, as Leith would no longer need to worry about hiring and paying employees or even about factory lawsuits, since he could instead replace all of the employees with these larger, stronger toys that could also be used as a selling point for Playtime Co's famous tours. To pitch this idea,
Comunque, se ci pensi è geniale, eh? La problematica è ammazzare le persone, però comunque è geniale.
Work on experiment 11.
No, è il logo della maglia, è la maglia di Carhartt, Marco. C'è il loghino. La macchia di caffè è sotto.
60, a bigger version of the toy Boxy Boo, which
Che sembra molto simpatico.
ended up being a massive success. Similar to Poppy, it could move, breathe, and think like a real human, with the only real downside being that he required food to survive, unlike the prototype. Harley showed Boxy off to Leith Pierre to pitch the program The Bigger Bodies Initiative, which Leith would ultimately
Ma ragazzi, ma lui in quale gioco c'è? Scusatemi. Lui non c'è in nessun gioco. L'abbiamo mai visto?
approve of, assigning each bigger body Harley would create with their own specific task. Boxy Boo's was to be the factory's Punisher, as in order
Quello co-op. Epstein Island 4 Remake. Ah, ok.
to ensure
Però con solo giocattoli dentro, Rick.
nobody found out about the experiments they were working on, Harley would tailor Boxy Boo's appetite to human flesh, so in case any employees or tour guests saw anything they weren't supposed to, they wouldn't leave with the factory secrets, but that wouldn't be a problem for now. In order to ramp up production further, Eddie Ritterman would re-sign with Warrenbach Construction later in 1990 to build even more things. Firstly, creating a larger laboratory for the experiments under the entire factory where nobody would find it, offering $100,000 to Warrenbach to keep it all a secret.
Sì, ma sono d'accordo. Secondo me sarebbe un incredibile sex toy. C'è i denti è il problema, però tolti è bello comfy.
They would build the gas production zone, which would produce the red smoke and distribute it throughout the factory, specifically into Playcare as they needed to settle down the children, while they would also create the game station, a building connected directly to Playcare by a child-occupied train that on the surface was disguised as a playground area where children could have fun and play in their 3 mini-games: Musical Memory, a game of Simon Says, Whack-a-Wuggy, a game of Whack-a-Mole, and Statues, a game of Red Light, Green Light. However, in reality, this place was actually built so that scientists could test the children's physical and mental cognition in the games and pick the best ones for experimentation based on their performance.
Non mi avrebbero mai preso, ragazzi. Mai preso, mai.
Also creating the 3 games mascots, Bunzo Bunny, Mini Huggy, Huggies and PJ Pugapillar into real bigger bodies to run the games for them. With all these expansions, they would hire a ton of new scientists to work and mass produce these creations, like Dr. White.
Pensa, tu stai lì, ti portano i tuoi genitori qui a premere i bottoni, poi mentre esci ti fanno avremmo una proposta per te, King. E lo portano dentro a lavorare alla fabbrica tipo a 12 anni, 8 anni.
Another prodigy from the Young Geniuses program.
Bene, ma appena poi devi guardare WhatsApp potrebbe rallegrarti la giornata. Potrebbe rallegrarmi la giornata. Ora mi mando una foto e questa foto è... Il salame! Ma me ne incornicio.
And a biologist by the name PW who will
PW sta per Pinus Work.
matter more later. But together, they would start to mass produce a ton of these toys, creating some failures like Pianosaurus Experiment 1163, who acted like a rabid animal attacking anything in sight with no real other use, and Yarnaby Experiment 1163.
Mamma mia, lui stessa storia di coso, ci togli i denti, riflettiamoci.
66, who was once a child named Quinn Navidson, originally deemed to be a bad kid as his game station performance was low, but after being mentored by Harley himself, improved his score tremendously and would be chosen to be turned into the Yarnaby monster, who, for whatever reason, displayed an odd sense of loyalty to certain staff members, leading to Harley Sawyer manipulating this emotion by isolating himself with Yarnaby until he became so emotionally dependent on him that he could control Yarnaby and what he did completely, which would become a problem later in the timeline when something we'll discuss would happen to Harley, leaving Yarnaby grieving and unable to do anything for weeks. But as time went on, they also started to create more successful experiments, like with Huggy Wuggy Experiment 1170, who was tasked with being the playtime security guard and was seen as obedient, rarely fighting back with staff, and Kissy Missy Experiment 1172, who was similar to Huggy in almost every way. So the Bigger Bodies initiative was generally successful. They were building tons of new experiments that didn't always work, but they were at least getting better every time, and they even started to replace the workers in Playcare by creating toys like Miss Delight and various different clones of her to replace all the teachers in the school area.
Pensa a quei cristiani che devono pagare l'affitto con 5 bambini a casa, va la moglie e gli fanno no guarda amore mi hanno licenziato oggi, è uscito Woody e mi ha preso il lavoro Buzz Lightyear. Cioè, verso chi ti arrabbi? Cioè, come fai? Come la racconti poi come roba?
However, to cut costs even further, for their next project, they wanted to create a new bigger body that would spit the red smoke around Home Sweet Home where the children would sleep for them. And calling back to the Smiling Critters fiasco, they decided who else but a monster version of Catnap to fit the role. They had already, around this point, began testing bigger body versions of previous Smiling Critters like Bobby Bear Hug, Hoppy Hopscotch, and Dog Day. So they already had an idea on what to do and how to make him successful. So they began developing plans to create a tall,
Gli Epstein Files, guarda, stessa roba.
lanky catnap monster with cat-like qualities
Per un'esperienza lavorativa da Amazon.
and a gas delivery apparatus implanted into his esophagus. So while the creature roamed the area, red gas would naturally emit from his mouth while he breathed. They also detailed a long list of different children in Playcare they wanted to use for this experiment, with one in particular standing out among the rest, Theodore Grambow. Theo
Salutate Theodore, ragazzi, quello i chipmunks lui.
was a mysterious child who didn't really have any real
Non è molto realistico questo disegno di Theodore.
friends around him, and
Potrebbe benissimo essere Cristo Spalpo.
instead would often talk about having some kind of imaginary friend. And when looking through Theo's drawings, they would find a sketch of said friend, 1006, the prototype.
Audio!
who had seemingly escaped his cell and was now lurking around Playcare befriending Theo. However, this wasn't an even relationship, as the prototype would begin to use Theo, who would get caught digging through Playtime Co. employee files under the order of his imaginary friend, and would also steal
Non così immaginario.
2 sets of grab pack hands and green electric hand attachments. An extension they added to the hands to allow electricity to be transferred to doors and power them on. Then suddenly, one night at Home Sweet Home, Theo made a run for the exit with 1006, attempting to power on the doors to leave Playcare using the green electric hands. However, being only a 7-year-old child, Theo would accidentally misfire and shock himself, leaving
Vabbè, ma Tio è un coglione, regà. Tio! Ma Tio, dai le basi!
himself with severe
È uscito? Sai che non lo so. Rapido check. No, che Bing. Vai via, Bing. No. Tra circa meno di un'ora. Siamo in perfetto timing.
burns while opening the
A 7 anni, sì. Skill issue!
exit gate. But from here, something really interesting happened. The prototype at any moment could have made a run for it, leaving Theo to die and escaping Playcare alone. But in what must have been a moment of the true Elliot inside of him showing, he had a change of heart, and instead alerted authorities to Theo's injuries, saving his life, but getting himself caught in the process.
Oh, però, raga, il prototipo, hai visto? Ha salvato Tio, W prototipo. Ciao, che si guarda? Un riassunto sull'isola di Epstein e i suoi più grandi segreti.
Following this event, seeing Theo's rowdiness, they decided that he would be the prime victim to be chosen for Catnap Experiment 1188 in November of 1990, which upon operation could generally be considered a success, as he could walk around and spit the red smoke as he was supposed to. But that's not to say he didn't have a few various problems. For one, the children found Catnap to be really scary at first, which was obviously bad since he was supposed to be around them every night.
Brother, ma c'è una cosa, ti sorprendi? Guarda che cazzo hai buildato! Guarda cosa hai buildato! Come possono non trovarlo pauroso? King!
Plus, eventually his voice box broke, giving him a scary, raspy voice. But by far,
Chissà come sono terrorizzati. Sarà stato il vento.
his biggest issue was that he was seemingly obsessed with
Io, Raven, non solo ti voglio bene, ma ti mando anche un bacio, perché tu sei un goat.
the prototype. As a
Stiamo guardando tutta la storia di Poppy Playtime, perché oggi esce l'ultimo capitolo, no, esce un nuovo capitolo, non so se è l'ultimo, e quindi lo giochiamo appena finiamo il video, così che chi vuole seguire il videogioco può recuperare la lore guardando il video.
child, the prototype was his only true friend, and after saving his life in the Green Hand incident, Catnap saw the prototype like a god, following him around wherever he went in the same way a puppy would follow its owner. He was completely under 1006's control more than even the employees. But even more issues would arrive on November 20th, 1990, as inside of Playcare's playhouse, they had created a bunch of holding cells in order to hold the experiments until they were needed. And while attempting to confine Catnap into one of these holding cells, he would, in a fit of rage, escape and go on a rampage, attacking 6 employees and killing them before several tranquilizer darts were shot into him, subduing him, with one of the witnesses and reporter of the incident being the biologist PW.
Pinus work.
Urging for better safety equipment while seeing firsthand the inhumanity of these experiments and what it did to the children inside the bodies. Regardless, this situation would be covered up by the company, and afterwards, Leith Pierre would begin to put together a group known as the Resource Extraction Specialists, who were in charge
Non l'ho mai visti sti contenuti, raga.
of collecting parts and
Ce la puoi fare, Evelina, Evelina ce la puoi fare. Evelina, io sono completamente con te, quella verifica l'hai già killata.
evidence after tragedies just like this one. Also building an employee-only train station used so they could quickly move throughout the dangerous areas, which are good things, but they also cost the company a lot of money. For now, though, Catnap would keep getting evaluated into 1991, where things started to lighten up as the bigger bodies kept expanding. For instance, in light of the recent tragedy, they would also build the Safe Haven, a bunkered-off room that ran on its own power system with highly protected doors and safety features designed so employees in the event of another emergency could go and hide inside until it was safe to leave. And going back to play care, the scientists grew interested in experimenting on the child Marie Payne.
Vabbè, ma Marie si vede pure dalla sagoma che è una pazza. Cioè, con tutto il bene, Marie. Ma cioè, Marie, una psicopata. Ma sì, guarda, nemmeno dobbiamo vederla in faccia.
Who didn't fit particularly well inside, as she responded super negatively.
Fra, mi sono messo a vedere la tua live invece che studiare Giulio Cesare per le interrogazioni domani. Sono messo malino. Il mio Goat. Ciao Fado, mi raccomando. Ma tanto guarda, l'interrogazione è studiare Giulio Cesare, ma l'impero che stiamo costruendo noi è molto simile, quindi puoi imparare qualcosa anche guardando la live, Fado, non ti preoccupare. Giftate la sub a Fado, che se la merita veramente tanto, ragazzi, se avete soldi da buttare.
To the red smoke, having severe night terrors when administered, so they would instead turn her into an original toy experiment, Mommy Longlegs. A stretchy, long-armed toy that after creating was at first really concerning, as while she was loving and kind to her fellow orphans, she was violent towards the employees. So to get use out of her, they transferred her to the game station as the children's daycare attendant, while they examined from far away, and the children loved her so much that they even created a toy out of her to sell to the public, being another big success for Playtime Co. There was also another child in Playcare worth noting who was named Ollie.
Ollie sembra veramente simpatico.
A child who at first wouldn't seem notable.
Divano, grazie mille per la Sabina giftina a Fado, sei un idolo.
As he was just another kid in the thousands that flooded the Playcare's orphanage. But the main difference was he had a phone of some sorts that allowed him to communicate across the factory, specifically with another super important child, Poppy.
Ah, la spia, la talpa.
These two never saw each other, but at some point began actively communicating through this phone, where Poppy, who was struggling with being forced to let employees study her and take her apart, was able to confide in Ollie and talk with him to help calm her down.
Poppy? Yes, I'm here. Are you feeling okay? Did the bad men hurt you? The bad men don't say what they want. They don't care how much anything hurts. It's been weeks and weeks of taking things out and putting them back in and taking things out and putting them back in over and over and over. Nothing's ever gotten better, and it'll never get better. I'm nothing now, Ollie. You're not nothing to me. You're Poppy. I'm here, Poppy.
Beh, raga, ma loro top 1 friendships. Loro due lovers.
For you, I'll always be here.
Giving her
Un king Ollie, eh. Cioè, shout out a Ollie.
her only
Ti ricordi che ti piaceva ridere, piangere, fare l'amore.
true friend in the factory after being turned into the monster she felt she was. Speaking of monsters, following this, with all of these different experiments roaming around the factory, the secret was bound to slip at some point about what was truly going on down here. And at first, it would start small, as on March 21st, employee Marcus Brickley would report to
Pensavo fosse io Toby all'inizio.
Leith Pierre seeing a 1,000-legged monster in the cafeteria roaming around.
I took a peek beneath the gate, and some massive bloody thing was doddering about the bloody hallway.
Ma lui sta pippato fracico, raga.
You're sure it wasn't a person?
Ain't no person that's 50 feet long with 1,000 legs.
Not knowing it was a bigger body of PJ Puggabeller. Thankfully, though, this report stayed small, as Leith rubbed it off as being in Marcus's imagination, and eventually he forgot about it. However, just
Ma è Luca di Camera Caffè.
over a week later, on March 30th, employee Rowan Stoll, a Playtime Co. IT specialist, would make another report claiming it looked like the Huggy statue in the lobby was watching guests on the tours, unaware it was a living thing. However, unlike Marcus, Rowan kept investigating and started digging into Playtime Co.'s secrets in search of answers, learning about the Bigger Bodies initiative and what Playtime Co. was working on behind the scenes, which obviously horrified him, and he wanted to get the word out. So he would use his IT skills and uploaded all of his findings onto a computer server.
Vabbè, raga, ma lui è stato reso polvere. Cioè, ma ti pare che vuoi snitchare i segreti del luogo? Metti tutto online? No, ma lui è morto.
However, quickly,
Ma lui non ha mai più visto la luce del sole.
Playtime Co. caught onto this and would try to kill Rowan by doing
Che strano!
things like messing with the wheels of his car, hoping for an accident. This obviously scared Rowan, since a big company was coming after him, and he realized his fate was coming near. So he wrote a letter containing the information to access the computer files he was working on, containing all of these secrets, sending it out to his mother on July 15th, 1991, while also recording one final VHS tape saying his final goodbyes, and detailing his plan to release all of his findings during the next week's security maintenance.
Next week, I've scheduled the company, the servers, the security to be shut down for 60 minutes of maintenance. While security is out, I'm going to release everything and run.
Where days later, they finally caught him in a room with Boxy Boo, who finally got to put his human appetite.
Vabbè, brother, ma cioè... La sorpresa è inesistente.
Work, eating Rowan's soul and killing him. Then a few more days later, on July 20th, during Rowan's planned maintenance, Playtime Co. would instead wipe all of their computer databases, including the files he planned to release, keeping all of their company secrets hidden, at least for now. Things generally coasted along for the rest of the year for Playtime Co., leading into 1992, where there started to be another problem, as with Elliot Ludwig being
Ma che paura sto quartiere? Ma che ansia?
dead, the employees seemingly started to store various different body parts inside of his house, including those of a young experimented on child that was eventually discovered
Simona, grazie del Prime. Simona, benvenuta, idola.
by the public, which obviously was bad for the company's reputation. And furthermore, on June 18th of the same year, for seemingly no reason, one of Playtime Co.'s best and most successful and obedient toys, Huggy Wuggy, would suddenly snap and break for Playtime Co.'s exit, escaping the factory during the night and wreaking complete havoc in the outside forest, killing multiple employees and even being spotted in residential neighborhoods. And while thankfully both of these incidents were able to be swept under the rug, as Elliot's neighbors already saw him as weird, giving them a good alibi for the body being there, and they managed to subdue Huggy without any of the public seeing him, these close calls were
Cazzo di paura.
They managed to subdue Huggy without any of the public seeing
No, brother, ma io mi ammazzavo.
him. These close calls were starting to get worrying, and also showed that the monsters were seemingly getting more and more aggressive over time, especially since in another experiment, 1199, the employees turned worker Thomas Clark into a brawn toy after he contracted lung cancer to try and save his life, but was almost immediately attacked by the other toys, who could tell he was an employee, showing how much more aggressive they were getting. Speaking of which, Harley Sawyer in the background kept studying his first creation, the prototype, who as well started to show more signs of aggression. For instance, in a log of Harley Sawyer's, he finally opened up and spoke to him, asking if he felt any kind of remorse for what he was doing to the toys, and how he was forcing them to live these terrible lives in the name of progress.
Ready to talk now, are you? I possess
A question.
Go ahead.
Porco due, che paura!
You feel anything? You stick us.
Beat us.
Tear at flesh.
Do you feel it?
But moving into Christmas
Mamma mia, la cacca nel pantalone,
of 1992, the accidents wouldn't stop, as the child Jack, who was a big fan of Playtime Co., was gifted
Salutate Jack, ragazzi. Ciao, Jack.
conducted a tour to the factory in the following year, 1993. However, while at the tour in the sector where the famous doughy dough was being created, he accidentally slipped over the guardrails and fell into the dough itself, consuming him and killing him right in front of his parents. This
E qua siamo belli informati, questo è il capitolo 4.
was another Playtime Co tragedy that they had to deal with, but
Grazie mille Mirtillone Zerone per il tier 1, benvenuto King!
thankfully this time they had a plan, as they had already been producing all of these experiments out of children for years now. So they decided to try and keep this story from reaching the public. They would attempt to revive Jack by turning him into a bigger body of his favorite toy, Doughy the Dough Man. The only issue is Jack was just a small child, and in order to create Doughy, he was going to have to be a large 900-pound beast. So
Quindi l'hanno fatto mangiare tantissimo e una volta toccato il picco massimo di obesità l'hanno reso un pongo gigante.
to complete the experiment, they would need to combine him with two other children they already had in play care. Those two being Matthew Hollard, an older and more mature child, and Kevin.
Ma io non la sapevo sta roba! Quindi Ciccio Pasticcio del 4 erano 3 ragazzini! Wild! Non la sapevo sta roba!
Barnes, a smart but also extremely temperamental child. And when combining all three of these to create Doughy, it was only partially a success, as the three personalities would constantly clash with each other and take control, with him sometimes being cute and friendly like the child Jack, wise and mature like the child Matthew, or on the negative side, angry and aggressive like Kevin.
Raga, Kevin poi sappiamo tutti che è nome da bullo. Kevin nome da bullo elementari, no? Codino, oppure doppio taglio, quelle robe lì. Kevin, cioè un nome, un programma, no? Un saluto a tutti Kevin. Kevin è il codino, bravo, esatto, tizio.
They would invite Jack's parents over to the factory to show that they saved their son. And upon entering...
Cioè, pensa alla reazione di tua madre che ti portano in una fabbrica. Allora, tuo figlio sta bene ma è un pongo, ok? Adesso lo andiamo a incontrare.
The testing chamber with Doughy, they were horrified by what they saw. A massive half-ton being of Doughy the Dough Man meant to be their child.
What did you do to him? Dear, look at it. That's not even human.
Regardless though, they tried to talk with the creature where instead of displaying the personality of Jack, he almost immediately became aggressive with the parents and started violently attacking them.
È uscito il gioco Se vuoi boss.
Audio.
Okay, I promise.
Grazie ragazzi, grazie. Adesso andiamo subito.
Mommy's only here to talk.
No, I don't want to talk. Get out! Susan, get away from it!
Jack?
And despite them begging the employees to be let out of the chamber during this attack,
Hey! Open this door!
the scientists couldn't just let them see this and report it to the public. So unfortunately, they had to leave it closed where both of the parents died.
Che sorpresa!
Open the door!
And afterward, Doughy realized what he did and switched personalities back to Jack, crying over both of his dead parents. So following all of these major incidents, the company, and specifically Leith Pierre, began to grow frustrated with Harley Sawyer. He had hired him to save the company money and their reputation after the Catnap disaster, but all of these incidents put them just one bad day away from the company being ruined again, which Harley was aware of as he began to grow extremely strict towards his employees and colleagues, urging them to be perfect and threatening that they were just one bad day away. He even went livid on the Playtime Co chefs for accidentally putting pickles in his sandwiches that he didn't like. So tension...
Brother, i sottaceti buoni nel panino, cioè nel cheeseburger importantissimi i sottaceti. Perché c'è questo bullismo verso i sottaceti?
were at
Cioè verso i cetriolini. Cioè la roba sottaceto mi fa un po' cagare, però tipo i cetriolini singoli hanno del potenziale.
an all-time high, and around this point, Harley ran into another major issue. He had kept
Non fanno cagare, non è vero, Crash, cosa dici?
experimenting on these bodies all this time, creating dozens upon dozens of experiments. But as more were created, he didn't really have anywhere to put all of them.
Ma che emoticone!
There were only a few cells inside of the playhouse to store them, and otherwise they would just freely roam around the factory, which led to issues like the Marcus Brickley one from before. So to try and fix this, he would begin to store the monsters inside of the Playtime Theater, where he would use the inactive experiments for the shows tour guests would watch to create an ultra-realistic experience, since of course the toy actors were the real things, solving the problem of having nowhere to put them. However, as the toys would begin to pile up in the theater, this quickly became a ticking time bomb that on one fateful day would go off, and the many toys shoved in the theater during a performance would, as you would expect, go haywire, attacking everybody inside of the theater watching.
Per farla breve, ragazzi, sono stati uccisi tutti. La mia domanda è, in questa roba io dovrei aver visto mezzo tutto. Quindi, allora, tanto questi sono tutti quanti delle C e le cosine di cui onesto non me ne frega niente. Se ho missato qualcosa mi va bene. Riassuntino finale, fabbrica giocattoli, padre con la figlia non se la incula, figlia muore, dopo che è morta se la incula, non letteralmente, la ficca in una bambola, questa bambola parla, quella renna parla, la cosa parla, raga, è andato tutto a puttane. Possiamo giocare il 5, abbiamo un'infarinatura. Possiamo andare a giocare il 5, facciamo l'infarinatura. La ficca non letteralmente, bravo, non letteralmente.